Good evening. Happy Sabbath, everybody. We are so thankful that you have joined us this evening for Visitor News Live. I'm Celeste Ryan Blyden, and I'm joined by my co host, Michelle Bernard.
Hello, good evening.
As we begin this evening, we are so excited that we have two really wonderful guests, historians. They're my go-to historians, Michelle. Whenever I need to know about, Adventist history in the Columbia Union in the early 1900s, I call on our two guests this evening. And they always have so many interesting stories to share with us about the Adventist Church's early history and how it impacted our church and our lives. And what is really awesome is that they know a lot of stories about what happened in the Columbia Union in those days. So this evening, we are so happy to welcome Dr. Doug Morgan. Wave at us, Dr. Morgan.
Hey, thanks
And
so much for the opportunity to be here.
yes, and Dr. Emory Tolbert.
Thank you. Happy to be here too.
Great. So we'll get started. They'll introduce themselves to us, but let's just start with a word of prayer, Michelle.
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for another Sabbath, an opportunity to rest and to learn more about you. And thank you for this time we have together. Thank you for this opportunity to learn and maybe be inspired. Just join our conversation. In your name, amen.
Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Amen. So let's start with you, Dr. Morgan. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I've taught history for a number of years at Washington Adventist University, and more briefly before that at Southern for a couple of years. But my current main preoccupation is helping with the new Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists, which went online last summer. It's a work in progress, but it's a great deal of fun. It's a great deal of work, but that's the main focus for me right now.
Great. And Dr. Emory Tolbert, tell us about yourself.
Yes, I am a professor of history at Howard University. I've been there for 30 years now, and I specialize in United States history and African American, and I have done a little bit in denominational history as well, and I'm glad to be here to participate as much as I can.
Great. Thank you. Well, Michelle, I know that you would probably want to tell those who are watching how they can connect and engage and join the conversation.
Sure. Whether you're watching us on YouTube or Facebook, we're encouraging you to pose some questions for the professors here. And I've already asked a question: who are some of your favorite Adventist change agents, or even if you just want to say hello and tell us where you're viewing from, we'd love to hear from you, and we'll give you a chance to join the conversation throughout the night. So say hi.
Yeah, we want to hear from you. So I am going to introduce you to the topic of tonight's discussion, which is what precipitated this was an email from Dr. Morgan sharing with me that he has published a new book. And the book is called Change Agents. And it says the lay movement that challenged the system and turned Adventism toward racial justice. And as I read about this book, this is about what happened in the Columbia Union in the early 1940s that helped bring about regional conferences. So I'm going to read to you, if it's okay, just a little bit, and then I'm going to ask you to talk a little more about this book, Dr. Morgan. So it says on page 14 of Change Agents, and I know it's hard to see it. There you go, Change Agents. And I know we'll put links in the chat and everything, but it says the time had come. The time for change had come in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but change was not inevitable. The Byard, meaning the Lucy Byard incident, might have stirred impassioned complaint, leading to a general conference action for a study commission that would issue a report filled with action plans that went nowhere. with the entire episode then left to fester among the untreated racial wounds debilitating the Adventist body. That did not happen because a group of lay members from Washington, D.C.'s two Black Adventist churches, Ephesus and First Church, powered by women more than by men, decided it was their calling to organize for change in a church governed by white clergymen and not give up until it happened. They met that very evening after the Sabbath ended on October 16, 1943, in the back room of a bookstore near Howard University, owned by church elder Joseph Dodson, to organize a movement for reform. Their goal was to unite the Black Adventist laity in confronting denominational leadership with the necessity of swift and decisive action toward realization of the racial justice and equality that the church claimed to espouse. The Committee for the Advancement of Worldwide Work Among Colored Seventh-day Adventists was born. Wow, these are the change agents of whom we speak.
Yes.
Dr. Morgan, tell us about this book, set the stage, and help us to understand what is happening here and who these people are.
Yes. Well, the Bayard tragedy and then the formation of the regional conferences are relatively well known. And as a matter of fact, the role of this committee is usually mentioned, in accounts of all of this. But I wanted to focus on the fact that the outcome was not automatic. In other words, my contention is that because these people took the action that they did, that contributed to a outcome which they did not seek, but arguably turned things somewhat in a better direction. So that's why I used the subtitle, Turn the Church Toward Racial Justice, after it had really been going backwards. It had been going in the, not just staying still, been going in the wrong direction. So I wanted to look at what was it about this group of people, just explore a little more fully who they were and how they went about this, because one very strong element of interest to me, which was touched on partially in that quote, is that here you have a group of Black lay people, and although men were significantly involved, Joseph Dodson was the chair of the group. I gather, it's my sense from the sources, that it was really women who were powering this effort. So this is a time when the church was more sort of totally governed by the clergy, for one thing. I mean, the lay advisory committees, even that type of thing, or there very little lay representation on committees. I mean, that's still an issue today, but back then I think is when the church was probably at its most hierarchical, and it was totally governed by ordained white clergy. And so the lay, the Black, the female, there's this concept of intersectionality that's talked about a lot. I'm not well informed on, all of the theory surrounding that, but there's a common sense application here, I think, that makes this, for me, particularly dramatic as to how they managed. They had no vehicle for expression. There was no recognized way in which, so they just had to find a way. And it's remarkable how they did that.
So what did they do?
All right, well, they organized. Now, some of them were veteran organizers. Maybe I'll come back to that before I get too far off track on the individuals. But another precipitant connected to the Bayard tragedy was that the vice president of the General Conference for North America, Elder Turner, made a ill-advised attempt to deal with the situation, even though he was warned not to do so. But he went down to the Ephesus church and preached a sermon that I think we can fairly safely say was, patronizing. It was basically just, we know that you're suffering, but be patient, be submissive, we'll work it out. And so James Montgomery, who was an elder of the church, but he was also a musician, and he stands up at the end, and I think the people are think he's about to play his violin like he usually does, but he says, no, I'm not going to accept this servants obey your masters. If you, the general conference, are the masters, and we are the servants at a time when my daughter could not even go to Washington, a missionary college, and so forth.
Yes. In fact, let me read it. Let me read it.
Sure.
It says, the General Conference Vice President came to preach at the Ephesus church, and he preached on 1 Peter 4:12, which says, "Beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened unto you." And when he finished, this gentleman in the audience, well respected, he stood up and faced the congregation, but spoke directly to Elder Turner. And he says, "Think it not strange? Yes, I think it very strange that there is an Adventist college nearby, near to which I cannot send my children. Yes, I think it is strange. A denominational cafeteria in which I cannot be served. And now this incident, I think it mighty strange." Mm-hmm. Page 2 of your book. Yes.
Yeah. By the way, I just might interject here that we're very much indebted to Jacob Justice and his book Angels in Ebony, that he published in the 70s. And I would just say that in my work as a historian, just about every time that I've found some other source that talks about this, he turns out to be right. I mean, he wrote in a very sort of, conversational style. And so, some people might say, well, what's your basis for that? But my testimony is that he's proven reliable in every case I've been able to look at. And he was close to Valerie Just, obviously his sister, and he knew the people that were involved. I think that he was not in Washington right at that time. And so he gives a lot of those details that are quite interesting. Yeah.
That's great. Dr. Tolbert, anything you want to share and add at this time about?
No, I think that's very well stated. And I'm pleased to get the information that you have in the book. Doug and I have known one another for a long time now. And one of the things we did work on together earlier was an article for the Visitor on the history of race in the Columbia Union. So he has continued, and he's written a brilliant book. One thing I did definitely remember was reading what you just read about the incident at the church.
Yeah.
One of the things that we have to understand, I think, is even though they didn't have necessarily official entry into avenues of protest or of attempting to get redress, some of the better organized and larger churches in the denomination were predominantly African American, and so there was a leadership there. In addition to Elder Wagner, there were lots of others who were capable and had shown their ability to evangelize and to organize sizable churches. And so so it's not as if somehow this was just a scattered group or a group that was helpless. They were organized already in many ways. And now the question was, shall we confront this problem that we now see is clearly before us?
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about some of the members of this committee that formed. The chairperson and the vice chair. Tell us about some of the participants in the committee? Who were they?
Yes. Well, maybe I could put it this way. There were some that it had lots of experience in organizing and activism, both within the church, but also outside of the church. So Alma Scott, for example, was very prominent in the Washington community. From a humanitarian standpoint, she founded the Southwest Community House, but also NAACP. And then there was something around late 1920s, early 30s called the New Negro Alliance that was boycotting stores where they didn't hire Black people. She was also, there was a move at one point to get rid of Mordecai Johnson, president of Howard. And the word is that she organized the alumni to prevent that from happening. So she was very skilled. And then Montgomery also, he became passionately concerned about social conditions. One day he saw a young girl, an adolescent girl, soliciting, and that was just too much, right? It wasn't the only thing. But he then shows how poverty lies is a structural thing behind all of some of these deplorable social conditions. He even testified before Congress. Actually, it was right around this same time. But then you had younger people as well. Alan Anderson had been among the group at Oakwood in 1931. In fact, according to now, I also want to say a big thank you to DeWitt Williams, because he wrote a book about Eva B. Dykes, but he collected interviews with people that are deceased now, and he shared those with me. That was a major source for the book. And Alan Anderson talks about his experience there at Oakwood, and he, I think, was a very intelligent and not an inflammatory type of individual, but strong, and had good wisdom, perception, and so forth. But Valerie Justice,
yes,
later Vance, I think she was, I think, the recording secretary. But she, I think, was the real spark plug. We find her writing letters to Elder McElhaney, for example, on the committee letterhead, kind of holding him accountable. You said you were going to do this. We haven't heard from you, and so forth. But having said that, Joseph Dodson, and who was the chair.
Yeah.
You mentioned that he was a businessman, but he was the elder of the church, and for many years, he even served as interim pastor for a year. And so I don't want to give the impression that that the men didn't do anything, but we might get to an incident a little bit later in the chronology where he's involved. But Valerie, I'm sorry, I'm jumping around from person to person, but Valerie was amazing in that she studied social work at Howard, but then she went on to the University of Chicago. She worked a year in Toledo at a newspaper, and then she taught in the South, and then she comes back to DC and is a social worker for the public school system. And she goes on to do all kinds of other things. In other words, she was a true activist. And here, I'll just tell everyone, if you want to get some good characterization of her, Calvin Rock he gave me an interview, and you read the book. I'm not going to talk about that in detail, but she was just amazing, and I think really gave this group the cohesion and we're going to see this thing through.
So let's make sure that anybody who's watching is following the story and understanding what happened. In September of 1943, a Black couple, James and Lucy Byard, come to Washington, D.C. by train, and they had made arrangements for her to get treatment at the Washington Sanitarium. And when she came to the sanitarium and the orderly or those who received her discovered by looking at her that she was Black, they had to figure out what to do quickly. And they offered her to be able to stay in a room down in the basement, and the doctors would come and treat her after hours, or they would have someone take her over to Friedman Hospital, which is today Howard University Hospital.
Maybe if I could just interject right here, Ben Baker really kind of questions that. Did they really make that offer? So that they said they did, but I just throw that in about a room, secluded room.
So that was kind of like the climax. Okay, there had been other issues going on, like the gentleman said. They weren't allowed to send their children to our university, the one you now teach at, and in fact, the president of Washington Adventist University now is Black, Dr. Weymouth Spence. But back then, Black people were not allowed to go to Washington Adventist University. They were not allowed to eat in the cafeteria at the General Conference, which was also in Tacoma Park. And so now here we have the hospital, and these are, Dr. Tolbert, you'll probably be able to tell us a little more about some of these people. Dodson, who is the chair, and as you mentioned, the elder of the church in D.C. So this is all happening in Washington, D.C. in the early 1940s. This gentleman owns a bookstore in Washington, D.C. He owns a taxi cab company and a funeral limousine service. George Daniels is on the committee. He's the choir master at First Church and has been a literature evangelist for 12 years. He's the recording secretary. Laertes Gillis is a lay leader in the First Church and was appointed the treasurer. Alma Scott, who you mentioned, is vice chair, and she's been involved in social service, civil rights for decades in Washington, D.C. Valerie Justice, who you mentioned, has just graduated from Howard University and was a research assistant and social worker for Washington, D.C. public schools. So, and then you have Willie Anna Dodson, a public school administrator, psychologist, noted for innovation, was Dodson's wife. Eva B. Dykes, we've heard that name, a Howard University professor who held the distinction in 1921 of becoming the first African-American female to complete a Ph.D., Dr. Eva B. Dykes, and Lula Cox and Helen Suglin, who were educators, leaders. These are accomplished Black Seventh-day Adventists contributing to the tithe, the offering, the growth of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They are members of two of the most prominent churches in Washington, D.C., and they are growing weary. They are growing weary. And after Lucy Byard died a month later at the Friedman Hospital, and Elder Turner comes to their church to preach and tell them, just be patient, change will come. They get together that evening and they say, enough. We have to do something about this. Michelle, in 2019, we worked with Dr. Benjamin Baker. We asked him to research the story for us, and we published it in The Visitor. And I know you're going to share that information on social media. And what do you want to share any more about that?
Yeah, I've already posted the link, and this was 2 years ago, and we're still getting a lot of people still reading it. It's not a legend that you've heard of the story before, and it's just great. Benjamin Baker really digs deep and gets a lot of history. So we shared that link there, and I really encourage people to check it. And there's many stories that we add, many different angles to it.
Mm-hmm. So Dr. Tolbert, any of the other, any people at this time that you can share a little information about? Any of the people or any of the stories that you can think of that you can?
I think what Ben did especially was very useful, because there were all sorts of rumors about what had actually happened at the sanitarium. And it was my understanding that in the correspondence that he shared, that the that they were setting up something, or they promised that they would, for Ms. Byard, that would put her in essentially isolation from the other patients who they felt would be greatly offended at having to have an African American person among them in a social setting. So that, I think what Ben did and what Doug has done and others is clarify exactly what was going on. Ben also pointed out, which I thought was very useful, that Jeter Cox, I think it was, who was a pastor in New York City, had recommended that she come to the Washington Adventist sanitarium because he had worked there once. And as Doug pointed out, things had gone backward because there apparently was a time when they would have tolerated the presence, at least, of African Americans at the institution. Doug, I think, has done a great job in saying, and giving us details on the lives of the people there. He actually began that some time ago, and the works he'd done on two previous books, which have detailed who the people were. The figure who was best known from that situation was Eva B. Dykes, even though she was not necessarily the most prominent person involved. She continues to teach at Oakwood for many years, and she is noted for her scholarship and her contributions to the church as a scholar. But what has impressed me all along was not just the quality of the leadership and the lay people in the local churches around the country, but their grasp of what could be done. I would point out just one thing quickly, and that is the solution to racial separation and discrimination within religious denominations has been, in most cases, I believe, the creation of an completely different denomination. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, and later on the National Baptist Convention, and so the creation of a semi-independent unit within the church rather than a separate unit, completely, was, I think, an interesting idea. And as Doug pointed out, the African American layman did not ask for that. And I remember, because I was under the impression they had for a long time, they did not ask for that, of course.
Yeah. What did they ask for?
They wanted an end to racial segregation. They wanted access, as several of the laymen said, to the university, or in this case, the Washington Adventist College or Columbia Union College. They want to be able to eat in the cafeteria, at the general conference. There was that's what they wanted, and there were other issues which we probably won't get into. We probably shouldn't. There's no time. But there were theological issues involved as well, and what I consider to be the gross misuse of the writings of Ellen White to support some of this behavior. And all of that needed to be looked at as well as a part of these changes that needed to be made. Quickly, Mrs. White did not call for racial segregation. She called for a work dedicated to African Americans. And that's, I think, a distinction that needs to be made. In cases where there was danger involved in racial integration, she said, until the Lord shows us a better way, that they would tolerate some separation. But this was not the ideal, and this was not theologically the right road. And looking at, and some of this needed to be talked about, and the leadership at all levels need to hear about it. So the women, I'm glad you're pointing out, because we know about G.E. Peters, and we know about Wagner, and we know about some of the others, but the laity needed to be talked about, because they were the ones who had the relative freedom,
Mm-hmm.
and that they were not employees of the denomination.
Right. Right.
They had the relative freedom to go ahead and act and to
Yeah.
say what they thought. And they did not buy the idea that they were as if they were somehow employees of the denomination. They were not. They were clear on the fact that no, this is our church.
Yes.
We support it,
Yes.
and we're not working for you. You work for us. I think that was an important part of the thinking of these lay people.
Yes. Yes.
So this is great. Thank you so much. They come together. They begin to meet. What did they do? Can you tell us some of the things that they did?
Well, they did all of the sort of the organizational nuts and bolts in an amazingly rapid fashion. They one of the members' relative was a printer. They got him up in the middle of the night and got their letterhead and began calling. I think Emory made a really important point earlier that these people, these Adventists, I mentioned the church base is what I'm saying. In other words, they learned a lot about how to organize by running these churches and running the departments in the churches and taking it very seriously. And then they had started to have they had like an oratorical contest that the different high schools and junior high schools would come together. So again, as Emory was alluding to earlier, there were already some connections. So what the committee did, though, was to firm up those connections and start to build a network. Now, it was a very rapid sequence of events. So we don't have evidence of like strong chapters all over the place, but we do have evidence of several of them. And that probably more that there's just no paperwork left to say we're going to organize the whole Black Adventist laity. So they came from a standpoint of loyalty to the message, even to the denomination, because the specter of breaking away and a separate Black denomination in the past 2 or 3 decades previous to that, you'd had Chief, Mans, Humphrey, and this was the this overshadowed everything. But they had made their choice on that.
They were going to stay. They were going to
Seventh-day Adventist Church. But as Emory was saying, they were saying, look, this is our church, and they made a very powerful appeal. Speaking of theology, when they drew up their document, you call it a manifesto. Okay, so there's another piece of organization. You got to articulate your goals and give a basis for them. And they said, look, brethren, the way you're acting is not going to make it through the judgment. This is not Christ-like. I mean, they did it in better, more articulate language than I'm giving you right now. But I think that they really appealed to the best ideals that the church espoused on paper, and said, and so they didn't issue an ultimatum in terms of we're leaving or we're holding our money, but they brought everything to light. We're not going to just allow this to go on and not draw attention to it. And I think that definitely then gave the brethren a jolt. Galvin Rock, quote him in the book in that regard. It's not that they weren't aware of the problem. It's not that they had just had committees and efforts to deal with this and that for 25 years or more. But that now something really decisive has to be done. And it turned out that they ended up doing something that in 1930, so 13, 14 years later, they said, we're never going to do that. Stop asking for it. With finality, the General Conference has said, we're not going to do the Black Conference, which is what many of the more progressive Black ministers had been asking for. So it was a very complex situation, but it definitely, I mean, my contention would be that if this group had not said, all right, we're going to act and organize and insist on meeting with church leaders and sort of hold their feet to the fire, so to speak, that we might have had just maybe another round of talk, and then it fades, and then there may be a later explosion that's even worse, you see, if it's not dealt with. So I think that's their accomplishment.
That's great. Michelle, any thoughts, or anybody popping by on social media wanting to share or ask questions?
There are no questions tonight, but I recently posted a link to some of the documents that I think it was Dr. Morgan talked about from Benjamin Baker, and it's cool. Like, we found Lucy Byard's death certificate and a letter her husband wrote to G.E. Peters at the GC. So, I mean, there's some really cool stuff, and you can see pictures of some of the people who may have been included in this movement there. But I mean, it's really fun, some of the things we found.
I think we even found her gravesite and headstone in New York City, where she is buried. So we have all of that online on the visitor site, and we'll share links to that so that you can see and read more about that.
Even a picture of her. I think there's only really one good picture of her, and we have that too.
There's a fairly long history of African Americans trying to find ways to change the situation, either by asking for their own conferences or asking for support of their efforts, Humphrey and others like that. And so this is not a new issue. With Bayard, it's been around a long time by then. And there's one of the things that I found when I first looked into some of this was I found the letters from Dr. Howard, who was a layman there at DC, to the General Conference. And he was asking for support for an evangelistic series to be led by Elder Sheaf. And he wanted also for them to send a white minister so that they could show that the Adventist faith had made no distinctions between races. And the Dr. Howard, who was, I think, the uncle, is it right, of Diva B. Dykes?
Yes.
You know, Dr. Howard was making it very clear that they believed that that giving this image of the denomination would be a more accurate picture of what Christians should be than to have just all Black and all white services and churches. And of course, he sticks with it. I mean, he writes letters to Mrs. White asking for some information. What kind of light do you have to share about the racial situation? Things like that. And so there is this problem is being discussed in these, and you know, these churches, for instance, are being pressured in some cases to divide into Black and white. And they resist it, including some of the white members. And so to think that somehow there was an automatic separation of the races and that they could call upon that as the tradition within the faith when they had to deal with this situation with Bayard, they couldn't. You know, there was nothing automatic about the segregation, as Dr. Morgan indicated. They were going backwards, essentially.
So you all are saying that there was progress where you had Black and white members worshiping together in Washington, D.C.
Absolutely.
And they kind of regressed. What happened? Tell us about those churches.
Well, one thing I want to say, Emory, you put that in a sort of as an appendix, those letters from Howard to the autobiography that you helped Elder Edwin Humphrey put together. And I just want to say that was a landmark moment for me to read those. I mean, I had no, to see someone make this case so powerfully and articulately, I've been sort of just, Dr. Howard has been my man just about ever since. And so they had a racially integrated church, and as Emory said, that now this was back in the first decade of the 20th century, and the General Conference was convinced that the only way forward was a separate church. I mean, after all, that's the way things happened in America, and Washington. It's complicated, but it's a southern city. It's not exactly the same as the South, but the deep South. But they just were unable to see the nuances, and to see that that this a counsel from Ellen White about separation, as Emory was pointing out, is in situations where there's such threat of violence that if you're going to survive from day to day and have members of both races, then you need to be prudent. But they wanted to kind of see that as a sort of an absolute, and so something very remarkable was lost. I mean, it's pretty much lost to our memory, our historic memory as a church, as a denomination. And so that's why it was so refreshing to read in that book you put out, Emory, to read those letters. Man, powerful.
So what happened after they began meeting? You started talking about this committee making phone calls and writing a manifesto, and who were they reaching out to, and where were there other chapters or groups forming, and what kinds of things did they do?
Well, there was a group in Ohio that would be very important and active. There is in the General Conference Archives letterhead from the Philadelphia, the Ebenezer Church, with a group there. And they reached out to Arna Bontam, for example, who was an Adventist. He was no longer teaching in the Adventist schools, but through family and friends that he had built up, and he gave them some very, I think, wise advice. But they then presented to Elder McElhaney, the General Conference president. The one reason they rushed, I was saying this a few minutes ago, that they just sort of pulled together this organizational infrastructure because McElhaney had agreed to meet with them. And I think here's where Elder Peters comes in, who was the head of what they called the color department then. And I think he had a working relationship with Elder McElhaney. And so McElhaney agreed to see him the next day, October 17.
So he's the president of the General Conference at that time.
And they want to be prepared and go in and say, look, we have this organization, and it's not just us, we're organizing. So McElhaney's, I think it's significant that he was willing to meet with them, but his view of it was, all right, well, we should listen to lay people, but only as individuals. This organization has no standing. So he said, look, we're going to put this on the agenda for the fall council. And he kept putting them off subsequently. And this is where Valerie Justice would sort of push back with okay, we're handling it. Well, they kept the pressure on, and he did. And I think Elder Peters, again, was also very instrumental to say that we must have a meeting or go ahead with a meeting in the spring then of 1944 in Chicago to make a major change. And basically McElhaney, he laid out the options. He did not include in the options the full racial equality that they were
Great
seeking in
one.
terms of access, not only institutions, but to the jobs in the church, and just to equal dignity of treatment, and things like summer camps. I mean, think how important these things are, and to just to resolve that. But he said we can keep the status quo, or we can try to do a little better on what they had developed, sort of a intermediate plan where they would have a black union secretary where there was a sufficient black membership, or we can do separate conferences. But again, remember, that is remarkable in that it had been like with finality, never bring it up again in 1930, but now he does. So it's significant that he was willing to go that far to say, all right, we'll do something that we never, or that we said we weren't going to do ever. And well, let me stop there.
Well, and I'm looking, you say in the book on page 192, you talk about this, you mentioned the manifesto and the four freedoms manifesto.
Yeah.
So there were four things that they asked when they met with the General Conference President, Elder McElhaney.
Right.
And if I'm reading it right, they were asking for repair as far as in their power past injury done to the colored people, show exact and impartial justice to the Negro race, increased force of colored workers, and throw their influence against the customs and practices of the world. These are the things that they're asking the church for. And then in November, looks like Elder McElhaney indeed brought this to the General Conference officers and union presidents. And he urged the proposed rethinking of the colored work be truly comprehensive. And he proposed four things. It says the form of organization, the educational provisions and needs of our colored constituency, medical work for our colored people, and literature work, including the editorial policy of the Message magazine. And of course, we know Message magazine exists today. It is the oldest Black magazine for religion in North America or in the world, right?
Yeah. But at that time, it was edited by a white man. It came out of Southern Publishing, and so he would have Black Adventists write for it, but that kind of was not satisfactory, to have not to have a Black Adventist. And there were many capable, and the man that they appointed, Lewis B. Reynolds, was eminently capable. And so that was, so it was the committee was really asking for a comprehensive terms of employment, access to institutions, equal treatment for Black Adventist ministers. They were appealing for on the ministers' behalf that they're not treated with the dignity that is just becoming of a real colleague in ministry, and so that had to change, so they would go ahead.
Yeah, you know what is really interesting to me is that at this time, and we have in the past 40 or so minutes really painted a picture of what was happening in the church and the incidents and the treatment, and yet the Black church had grown to 17,000 members. Why would the Black church be growing? Why would people be joining this faith if they were coming into an environment that did not treat them well, that did not give them access, did not give them employment? Even the publications they put out didn't have their own people leading it. Their leaders couldn't eat in the General Conference cafeteria, even though they worked at the General Conference. I mean, why would the Black church, grow like this at this time?
One of the things that we I think, forget about the workings of Jim Crow or segregation is that with the separation, there was the appearance sometimes of a certain comfort. It's as if one group could pretend the other didn't exist, at least temporarily. So if you went to a black church, you didn't have to think about Jim Crow. The minister didn't preach about it, and not in the earlier days anyway. And so the growth had to do with the message of the Adventist Church, which was that Jesus is coming back and soon. And quite frankly, those who were baptized in the church or who were converted were thinking about that as the solution to the whole thing. I often point out that there were people who really didn't believe, as Doug implied, that these folk were not going to be in heaven anyway. The people who hated and who discriminated, and therefore let's think about the soon coming of Jesus as a solution. That was some of the thinking. That's not all of it, but that might explain some of the growth in terms of evangelism. The black local churches were active in communities. You had Dorcas societies. You had pathfinders. You had all sorts of things going on that were helpful to their neighbors. And this also, and powerful preachers. And I mean, I think it was it Ellen White who said that Chief was the most powerful preacher she'd ever heard?
Kellogg, yeah.
Oh, what was it? Oh, Kellogg said
Kellogg,
that.
yeah.
Okay. So he would have, I think, Doug knows more about this, but I think he had a tent that held hundreds of people at one point, and was a real sensation in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. And it was drawing both races at the turn of the century, man. That's when segregation was getting it to be the worst. But so it's quite a phenomenon. Yeah.
So some of that has to do with, I think, the deliverers of the message, and with the Holy Spirit, obviously. We don't convert people. The Holy Spirit does it.
Yeah.
And to give you a personal example that might give you an idea, my father became an Adventist in the 1920s, and my mother, of course, all of her life, and my great grandmother was an Adventist. So we go back a ways. My father told me that he went. This white Adventist minister came to his town, which was Sanford, Florida. And he was there clearly to preach to the white people. But my father became interested. And the minister said, okay, you cannot sit in the audience. You can sit behind the screen here. They were showing pictures. You can sit behind the screen and listen to the sermon. And then I'll talk to you after the service is over. And he said that worked for him. I was saying to him when he was still alive, I said, Daddy, that was the Holy Spirit. There's no way in the world most of us would have joined under those circumstances.
Yes.
But I think that the growth. I mean, I'm giving you different reasons why they grew, why the church grew.
Yes.
And well, that's enough.
Wow. Well, yes. Go ahead, Doug, and then I'm going to share a little bit about what happened as we come to conclusion.
Well, no, I just think you also are making the case that they were saying, well, it would grow more, certainly.
Yeah.
We would have a much easier time at evangelizing, and in the transcript of the meeting in Chicago, the Elder Wagner and others were saying, even relating incidents from their evangelism where people would say, well, we believe that your message, but look how you're being treated, So it was a barrier. And I believe the growth did become greater after it accelerated, I believe, after the regional conferences.
So in 1944, just about 6 months later. So for those who've been following our story tonight, talking about incidents that happened and how Blacks were treated in the Adventist Church. And yet they continued to grow, and you're saying powerful preachers, and they believed in the message. And a lot of this like coalesced around Washington, D.C., Tacoma Park, where the world headquarters and university and our hospitals and other things were. And Black lay people, including many women, stood up and organized. And they went to the president of the General Conference, these change agents, and they lobbied him, and they put out document manifesto, the four freedoms. This is what we want. We are giving, we're contributing enough of this. And he went to his colleagues and leaders at the General Conference, and they talked about what could they do? What could they do to help bring about this change? And in 1944, in April, they go to Chicago, right, for the Spring Council. And in Chicago, and I'm reading from your chronology, this is something we've also shared in the Visitor, but it says Spring Council approves organization of conferences to be administered by colored officers and committees. Spring Council recommends, number one, establishment of a school in the North to provide advanced training for Black STA youth. And we know that school is Pine Forge Academy in Pine Forge, Pennsylvania, right here in the Columbia Union. Number two, appointment of a Black editor of Message magazine. And number three, publication of a periodical for Black constituency similar to the Union papers. And I wonder if that was the beginning of the Regional Voice, which continues today as well. And number four, establishment of a commission on meeting the medical and nursing education needs of our colored constituency in the North. And then something very interesting happens. This committee of lay people, these change agents who, wouldn't stop until the GC did something, they disbanded. Can you tell us a little more about that? And
yeah. Well, let me say real quickly, just before that, as an example of the way in which these lay members, with all due respect, but yet with no backing down, they sort of pushed the boundaries wherever they could, so that Joseph Dodson, and then by this time Addison Pinckney, who was later a president of Oakwood, had come onto the committee. He was an educator and a journalist. They went to Chicago with the Four Freedoms tract. And see, McElhaney, he realizes, okay, we got to let some lay people in here on the committee, but he pointedly did not bring them in. He got someone else, but they came into the meeting. And McElhaney says, well, we'd have to disband this and reconstitute the General Conference Committee to see if we can approve. Well, they could tell that he didn't want them there, but he agreed to let them distribute their tract, which I think is, because that is such a powerful document, I think that had to have made a major impact, not just necessarily short term, but on the thinking, at least of some of the people there. But then they acceded to his request and did not continue as an organization. However, this is where the Ohio branch, this is maybe a little bit lesser known aspect of the story, came in and said, wait a minute, especially because the Columbia Union initially said, all right, we're going to form the Black Conference, or the Colored Conference as they called it. But then they started to get cold feet. The word was around that that they well, first they were going to just organize it basically what's Allegheny East now, that they were going to leave out Ohio and Western PA. And so anyway, so the Ohio branch, they pick up the organization, and put the pressure on for the Columbia Union to go through. And then some of these same Ohio people then later episode, a landmark in Adventist history, in the 1962 General Conference, the Layman's League, led by Dr. Hale and Milas Martin. But Estelle Barnett and some of the other Ohio folk who had come in as initially a branch of this 1943 committee were instrumental in that.
It's great. It's so amazing to hear how all of this happened in our union, isn't it, Michelle? And to hear, you've got more information. Tell us about the information you have on what we did in the Visitor about all of this.
So we went beyond 1943 and talked about how they mentioned before the Allegheny Conference getting together in 44. It wasn't the first regional conference, but it was one of the first. And we've shared, researched more about this, shared several articles. I'll put them in the conversation area later. And we mentioned before, we have some pictures of some of the first workers from a large group meeting there. Mm-hmm. So it's really cool to see these people and just to see who is doing that in the history. So I'll include some of those, including, this is another VNL topic, shameless plug, that, we have articles asking about what they're doing today. Why are they still existing? And we talked with Calvin Rock about that a couple weeks ago or last week. And I'll share that too, so you can get caught up to modern times too.
Mm-hmm. It's great. Yeah, we dug up some photos of Allegheny Conference, their first employees, and there they are all standing in front of the building after they were established. But I think Dr. Tolbert, Dr. Morgan, you pointed out earlier this evening, once they got the regional conferences started, the membership just really grew exponentially. And, obviously getting Pine Forge Academy started and, getting Black leadership and, just the church grew and flourished under their leadership.
I think it's probably something that we ought to be aware of, at least what I've been told by the people who are still around who remember all of that they were expected to fail. And that they attribute the willingness to form these conferences in part to the expectation of some of the people in administrative positions at the General Conference that they would fail, that essentially they had no experience, they didn't have any money, and that, of course, that is not what happened. They grew exponentially, as you said, and it's important to realize that African American people, whatever experience they were not given access to, knew how to organize churches. They knew how to evangelize, and so whether they had their own conferences or not, they knew how to do that, and they had a long history of doing that very thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And today we mentioned that in 1943, as all of this was beginning and happening, there were 17,000 African American members in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and now today, nearly 80 years later, there are 300,000 Black Seventh-day Adventists in the regional conferences. There are more who are members of state conferences and in other places, but in the regional conferences, those fledgling conferences that were developed from all of this with the push of those change agents, those lay people that we talked about tonight, helped to develop, and it has grown, and they have contributed greatly to the growth of the overall Seventh-day Adventist Church and continue. And I think that's what Michelle was talking about in the article that we dug up and did the history and shared all that. Talk about the ways that they continue to minister and contribute to the growth and work of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, particularly in our cities, where many people don't have churches or ministries going today. Our regional conferences are still there. And as we have seen in the coronavirus pandemic, there's been great needs. A lot of people are hungry. A lot of people are unemployed. A lot of people are hurting. And we've done programs and articles about how in our cities, many of our regional conference churches are the ones providing meals and groceries and clothes and support for all people right now who are suffering and struggling through this pandemic.
It's worth
So
pointing out that the regional conferences never advocated racial segregation. That I can't think of an incident of anybody of any race being turned away from a regional conference church because of race. And I point that out because you don't just have Black people in regional conferences. And if you have Korean churches and Romanian churches, and certainly Spanish-speaking churches as well. And so there's a great variety in those conferences, along with the Haitian and Canadian and the other congregations as well. So they didn't try to be narrow. They wanted to broaden their work. They were just fighting Jim Crow. They were fighting racial segregation and discrimination, but they never lost sight of the global responsibility of evangelizing.
It's great. So as we close, it's time to close, and we're so thankful for what you have shared tonight, kind of taking us through some of the details of this book that you have written, Dr. Morgan. I guess my last question for you would be, why did you write this book? Why do you have an interest in all of this? And why did you decide to share this story with us?
Well, part of it is just it grows out of long-standing interests, and I've done some study about Adventism in Washington, D.C. But then I would say that there are two other things that prompted me more immediately, and actually they both come under the heading of an interest in the church and how change that might be needed can happen in this moment when we have racial tensions. It's too weak a word, but they're reformulating in new and very ugly ways, and our church is inevitably connected with that in complex ways. And it just seemed like to say something from a historical standpoint that might help inform us as Adventists a little more fully about our past, and to see that there are some things that we can take as instructive, both in a good sense and in a sense of warning of what to avoid. So I think those are some of the factors that sort of came together in prompting this.
It remains relevant for our time.
I think so.
Our history informs our time and remains relevant. Dr. Tolbert, we thank you as well. We love the stories and the information that you add. And what's your closing thought you want to share with us tonight?
It's my pleasure to be able to participate in this. And I'm very pleased that this book that Dr. Morgan has written, and I think it's long overdue in a lot of ways. He pulled all sorts of things together that we needed to know about. I won't go on and on except to say that I'm optimistic, obviously, about the future based on what we're learning, and I think how we're changing. And I think we're all change agents at some level, and that we can keep working on improving and bringing the gospel to the world in a way that truly reflects Jesus Christ and what he did for humankind.
Thank you. Beautifully said. I'm optimistic about the future. Aren't you, Michelle?
I am. And excuse me, I thank you both for this. And we do have another comment from someone. It sounds like they want to learn more too. She says, in this day and time we live today, and I think she's saying this kind of conversation needs to extend beyond February. And I think it's true.
True.
So thank you both so much.
Thank you both.
Joy and a privilege.
Thank you. My pleasure. My pleasure.
Okay. Good night, everybody. Thank you for watching.
Good night. Good night, folks.